Ron, as you move forward, I don't know if you have anything in your future slides, but a lot of concern here is wrapped around this assurance that there would be water, and then there's not. Um, are you going to elaborate on how firm those assurances were back in December and January, or not?
Sorry about that. Obviously, December, January seems like a long time back in terms of the fact that, particularly December that we had. Certainly, as we moved forward, the snowpack question obviously was one that was very difficult. I think looking back, both in terms of total temperatures through 2014, a lot of studies by USGS talking about how warm across California, that was the warmest from just an overall temperature standpoint, not focusing on any particular hot July day or week, but overall, that certainly took a toll on just the setup of the temperatures here at Shasta and any of our other lakes. Certainly for 2015, we've had in Redding, for example, a really, really warm streak, so that's just kind of continued. There's a very high surface temperature out in the Pacific that's just causing a lot of issues all along. The starvation of sea lion populations, I think the issues with salmon out in the ocean conditions are not particularly good. Anecdotal evidence from people that go out and just recreational fishing on the ocean are finding some pretty starved fish. I think from an El Nino projection standpoint, looks very interesting, and the real concern about the temperatures moving forward. I can talk quite a bit about what the levels of uncertainty are that move forward and what things are more.
I guess what I'm looking for is were these uncertainties communicated to farmers who rely on your water?
Yeah, I think from the perspective of, well, my interaction with farmers, growers, irrigation districts, not just this year, but frankly going from wet years, uncertainties about biological opinions and how they may affect or droughts. I think those in the agricultural community understand uncertainties and understand that there's something with that. And yeah, they do make base decisions, and we really do talk through the details. And quite frankly, our discussions revolve around what are the risks. A lot of this is a risk management question. You can go on about 4 or 5 things that relate to risks, even as we know them now, and some would say, oh, isn't the year pretty well set by the time you're in late June? Well, depletions in the Sac Valley is still a big wild card that John's staff, my staff, and the consultant community that serves a lot of the folks within the agricultural world in California still have. There's still a range of what that could be, and that's probably as it relates to flow to the Delta in the 100,000 acre foot range, which is a significant chunk of what we're trying to deal with at this point. What I'll kind of point on is a lot of our discussion about what's the risk management of this cold water pool that we have and trying to get what would be perceived as making the best of a bad situation for winter run Chinook revolves a lot about, well, what's your projection of ambient air conditions for the rest of the summer? And and I have a graphic here that shows how you look at that could be very significant and can really play into how you manage that particular risk, and why I think the flows that we're currently working with as a working discussion as a base set of base flows are fairly low in the June-July timeframe to hedge against that kind of bet, where if I talk to my growers within the Sac River Summit contractors or within the Delta components, their needs are fairly well accelerated. given the dry spring, warm conditions, the limited water that they have worked with, in the context that trees will probably harvest earlier than they would on average. Row crops certainly are going to be coming off the field a little bit earlier. Rice is probably a little on the early side, even though they started a little bit late. All those things will take this depletion generalization that is a real thing, but really hard to put your finger on a specific item other than a general index of just what's going on out in the agricultural world, is that June, July, this last part of June, probably 3 weeks into July are going to be our probably most intense period in terms of seeing depletions in the Sac Valley. Yet that's the time we need to be the most cautious with the releases of the water for Shasta from a temperature management standpoint, where August may be where we've turned a bit of a corner. And so how do we leverage that reality is pretty much we've spent a lot of work in the agricultural water project. How do we get through this, given there is a shift that's gone on as to the timing of the release of this water?
I guess what I'm hearing, and I'll just repeat it back to you, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that in fact risk is a conversation that you do have throughout the season leading up to the spring and fall, or spring and summer, and so this is not like a risk is always there, and that is a conversation that folks are accustomed to having with you, and I assume with the state project as well.
Yes, certainly. I mean, and as I said, there's a whole host of those things, and obviously anything that's really dependent on the weather, like farming and agriculture, has certainly that aspect of it. What's really been a strain in that community and that sector of our economy is how to then superimpose that on uncertainties that are of a regulatory context. Heaven forbid, and a malfunctioning probe on a temperature measurement device is that just a tip of a aging infrastructure? A canal failure or a lining failure on a canal could have very significant changes as well. The point is very well taken as to why, although you had some inconsistent data, why weren't we more on top of that? And why weren't we in that particular mode? And my only comment back to that is we were trying to do the best with what we had and didn't notice this particular problem and the significance of it until we actually got later into May. And at that point, tried to be timely in our response back that this is a change, communicating that both to the board and through Tom, as well as to those that were maybe in the midst of some growing decisions. And so we're doing everything we can to scramble to work within the plan that we have now, both from a fishery management standpoint and how we can use this quantity of water potentially and to leverage as the seasons unfolded across the other potential resources to kind of make ends meet. And I'm seeing a lot of cooperation with the agricultural community and a willingness even in the M&I community to see what we can do. And it doesn't matter which basin it is. It's the American River Basin, Sac Valley, south of the Delta. But there is a lot of concern. I think that folks are very interested about this couple 100,000 acre feet that's going to be backed up in the Shasta. So on one hand, the good news isn't like we can't find 200,000 acre feet of water, that's disappeared. We know where it is. It's going to be very difficult to get that out and maintain a situation that doesn't drive us to another really bad circumstance. I'm sure that we'd hear that from our fishery colleagues, is that a bad experience with regard to temperature management and winter run Chinook is going to set us up for a really high stakes game next year, particularly if it is dry. I think a lot of people realize that, this snowpack situation is a huge driver here. And this is just indicative as to just how tight we're being asked to do a lot of things with very limited resource. So That's probably a very, very long-winded way to try to be responsive to your question.
Circling back some of Mr. Lehigh's comments, I'm sure you can't give an exact amount, but to a certain extent, as you said, there's some flexibility in the system, and do you have a sense to communicate to folks how much of the 250,000 acre feet can be quote unquote made up by moving different parts of the system?
Well, I think what you see in the plan right now is where that 250,000 is made up, and some of it is from Oroville, some of it is from Folsom, some of it is the assumption on the reduction in the regulatory flows from July on as part of our TUCP request. So it's spread out everywhere within the system. I think maybe one of the points that you may be coming to that's important here is, as part of the normal process, we will continue to true up these forecasts and these plans moving forward. I think, getting back to your question, risk is an inherent part of the delivery process, the water delivery allocation process. I think we try to manage that risk. So, for example, we base our allocation decisions on conservative estimates of runoff and other parameters in the system. And occasionally, 9 out of 10 times, you're going to be fine with that promised amount, but then you get extreme events. So the most recent example for a state water project was the second year of the drought, when we were experiencing the driest calendar year on record, 2013. We had to cut back that allocation later in the spring. So that to some extent, that is part and parcel of the process. That's not to say we need to try to, I think we need to try to be as creative as possible in trying to, when things do go south on us, trying to alleviate to the extent that we can those shortages that are hurting folks. So I think we will continue to work with Reclamation on, as we do true up these plans moving forward through the summer. Is there some volume of water that is freed up by some of our assumptions being more conservative than what actually took place, and where can we start filling in some of these holes if that is the case?
I thank you for that discussion. I think what I'm getting at is the legitimate concern communicated by the legislative representatives of the people affected. And there's a message coming to us that's consistent, that there's like an on and off switch. Oh, you keep it in Shasta, so now it's not available to support the economic decisions we've made. You're leaving us high and dry. What I'm fishing for is some assurance that through our real-time management, all parties, stakeholders included, are working to make those, the shutoff of water not happening. The fear of the complete shutoff of water can be ameliorated through active management and creative and flexible solutions, so that it isn't an on-off switch that, as has been portrayed to us today. But the concern is real. But through these management approaches, flexibility in the system, deliveries still can be made to growers. Can we provide that assurance as we move forward through the summer?
Well, I think one thing that, as it relates to the real-time, I think the real-time operations and how do we squeeze out every last drop that we can in an especially tight year. I think you've seen that in how the real-time function has been hyped up to another level, whole nother level this year, starting back in December in the turbidity management. As we've gone through the year, now we've got this working through this temperature plan, and we haven't seen the type of real-time coordination anywhere close to the level and up and down agencies outreach to stakeholders. I think it's definitely unprecedented this year. as it relates to that effort. And again, trying to squeeze out every last drop that we can to reduce the impacts across the board to the extent possible.
So there's a couple of categories there of squeezing out every last drop. There's the conserved water and perhaps an ability to, through a series of transfers and exchanges, and maybe if we could hear from you about those institutional barriers that Les highlighted earlier, and what can be done to overcome those barriers, and if there's anything that the state board could do to help overcome those barriers. Perhaps not, perhaps it's, just between the department and the Bureau. And then the other category of squeezing every last drop out with respect to the plan itself. I'd like to better understand the adaptive management nature of the plan in terms of what can you do with monitoring, more frequent monitoring on temperature, monitoring for fish needs. What are, can you hone in on that June, July, August timeframe on critical needs for the fish, for the refuges, for farms? And maybe it's not as critical on farms, and maybe it's just more of an issue of taking an opportunity where you can to quickly move water where there's an excursion, ability to have an excursion on temperature. And I don't know the answer to that, but I'd like to at least hear from you about opportunities that you could identify within the plan itself.
The plan itself, we can certainly hit on that, which as I walk through the rest of the slides. I will just say as a general sense, though, I don't know that it's an institutional question. I think if we come into something, if there's an opportunity between someone who has water versus someone who needs it, and is there an opportunity to exchange, I think that if those daylight and there is a institutional component to that, we'll daylight that pretty fast. And I think our experience within, whether that's a question within the fishery agencies or the project agencies or with the board staff, I think we've been in a position, because we've been at this now for a little while, to move fairly quickly. The component is that if there's an entity that has some water and they've kind of scrimped and saved because they're thinking, preparing for next year's if we're still in a dry cycle, their willingness, and I think that there is, I've kind of seen willingness to work with that, whether it's state contractors that might have a little bit of water south of Delta that can help with some of the south of Delta questions, because Delta pumping is going to be very difficult if we continue on the track where we see fairly high depletions here into August. Is what's the probability of getting that water back? Now, it's one thing to say, gee, I've got this bank account of some water at Shasta, and certainly everyone understands, in the conversation we had, that we first order business is deal with that temperature situation. But once that alleviates itself, would reclamation in this particular example have the flexibility and the practicality of being able to stack that water on what would be minimum releases anyway, plus the whole discussion about transfers that we've talked about several months back, plus an increment of potentially paying back some IOUs of some exchanges. We really think we need to be able to communicate whether that's in play or not. And that's kind of a twofold question. One is, were you successful in managing your temperatures? If you have a wipeout on the temperature end of this, I think that answer changes, just to be very frank. Because I think some folks will then say, boy, you really need to kind of hold this water because you need to be very conservative about the winter run next year. But if we are successful moving through this, and I think there's reason to think that we'd be at a much higher level of success rate than our previous discussions on these temperature plans, is that will there not be something else that would suggest keep that water upstream? Because we need to be clear on our negotiations. going forward. And I'll just, if a generic state water contractor says, I've got 10,000 acre feet of water in San Luis that I was going to carry over into next year, I might be willing to allow that to go to, let's say, exchange contractors now if I know I can get that back in January or by January, so that it's firmly in place back in San Luis. That means that we've got a whole fall to be able to maybe release that water out of Shasta and make that available. But we got to be able to know that we're going to be able to do that. And I think there's the question operationally, can we make that happen? But then there's also the question of this 250,000 acre feet of water, you know, can a portion of that reasonably be used, and is there going to be another concern? And I think we've been pretty open with the 5 agencies and board staff that, yeah, I think to take the edge off of this, there's a path forward, but it will include that element. And that's probably enough said on that question. I think I kind of hear that almost in code in some of the comments from those that have spoken already on this issue. But
I think we'll come back to it over and over again once we get to the other panels and
Sure.
speakers. And I'll add into that mix that the folks in Sacramento who are being asked to go to what they perceive or believe and maybe as a perilous level are going to want some credit there too. That
Right.
it's not going to be forgotten as you deal with water that you're going to need for salinity control through the rest
And
of the year.
certainly to that case, and it's a different type of this. What I'm seeing is it's not kind of a one-size-fits-all. And we have a unique set of situation and circumstances within the American River Basin. But I think that there's some partnerships there that we can leverage. But again, knowing how does that fit with East Bay Mud, for example, and how does that then intertwine with some of these Sacramento River releases? So kind of knowing how I've always treated this as the cornerstone of this, just because it's a big flow quantity and it's going past the Sac River settlement contractors, and they're sucking up a lot. I'll say that in a good way. That
There are drought
to
angels
try to
everywhere.
make these releases work for them through the critical growing period, and I give them a lot of credit. And it's been a real hard slog for them as we've gotten some warmer temperatures. And and we've been then trying as the projects to work through that. I think one of the things, talk about uncertainties, going into the season with salinity management in the Delta and a rock barrier that DWR installed, and the experience of last year with June being a very difficult tidal cycle, we seem to be navigating through that fairly well. And that's a sigh of relief, because we thought if we can get through the really high tides of June, that things, we at least have something to measure off of to go through July and into August. So that's a bullet dodged, if you will, in that regard, which then gives us something to think about how you build the plan for the next month ahead.
Question about timing. So especially the exchange contractors and Friant, I don't even know if that transfer is an option at this point. So again, getting back to my question earlier about helping us with the matrix so that we can have information about what the, at the diversion level, what that means in terms that we can all understand with respect to Friant, Folsom, all the entities that have expressed concerns, including the fish agencies. But the timing on this sort of mitigation strategy with respect to what to do with the water that would be held over in storage, you have crops in the ground now, and then I don't know how much water is remaining in the system that's already south of Delta, but if those releases have already been cut back for a while, I imagine there's, no pumping or very little pumping going on south of Delta. So at what point do those water agencies fall off the cliff with respect to just running out of water?
Well, I think there is a quantity of water south of Delta, and I think that that quantity is obviously earmarked in a lot of different ways, so it's pretty well spoken for. Again, this really depends on like incrementally, can we put together some exchanges? And again, this comes back to, do we think that we can see a path forward operationally to be able to move some water in the fall? We've obviously trying to weigh this with the timing of the grasslands complex and watering that up in terms of the whole refuge management aspect as well. There is there's not a lot of water south of Delta, but there is some, and I think that there's some ability to do some flexibility. But again, it comes back to this question of, would we be able to credibly put together a operation within a range of some of the parameters are still unknown, that's viable, that the ones putting up some water are willing to go out and help their neighbor? And that kind of goes to the, will this be the storyline as we look back at this time? And I think that, yes, but I think the lubrication for that is a piece of this component of this water. And, our assumption is, and I think going forward in how we've presented this as a plan, is that we would envision to look for opportunities to move a block of some of this water. It's probably not the whole quantity, because it's going to be a tall order, unless it is a super dry fall, that we're going to be able to, at some point, we'll see some fall conditions that would say, hey, there's water there already to be able to do operations in the Delta. Now you need to kind of back that off, because you don't want to get stuck into a high release. But some component of that as a backstop for some understandings of how some exchanges could be done will be very helpful. And I think that will give us a path forward. It's going to be a tough ride, I think, for the exchange contractors. And, we've tried, again, this is probably, are we being as straight talking as we can be? The answer is yes, and they're going to have to probably go to some groundwater resources to be able to get through there. We've had some tough discussions about availability of water on the upper DMC, and to the point where we're putting some pumps along the canal, or the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority is installing some pumps from reclamation, just in case there's an interruption or very limited Delta pumping for a time, to be able to get water from the San Luis unit or complex back upstream to the DMC for folks that had water in San Luis and had hoped on making some exchanges. I mean, there's a whole lot of contingency planning going on, and the concept of a barge in Lake Folsom is the same type of thing, is that physically, the question is, do you need to have these in place, just because a lot of things that could come, and we've already had a run of the worst case scenarios piling up, and that's going to be another one of those. In one extreme, the pumps we're talking about on the DMC would actually be decommissioned to be taken out to Folsom if it gets bad enough. So we're doing musical chairs with pump units potentially within this context. So timing-wise, I think the timing is probably, with all of this, getting closer and closer. I think quantities of water that have been contemplated as exchanges, I think the first cut is going to be probably an exchange contractor question that we'll need to know, where I think folks that are willing to do some exchanges will need to kind of know, do we see some flexibility in the fall operations to be able to make this work? I think so far, I think we believe that we can.
There will be more. I have to do a little time management. I broke all the rules of not doing a bio break at all this morning. I apologize for that, but it's very intense and very important to be listening. And I want to thank folks, not only who've already been here, but also on the web listening. I do think it's important for folks to listen through. We have a fair number of panels coming up, different points of view. We haven't even gotten to the fishery agencies yet. I have a number of public speakers, I'm sure, looking at the room. So from a time management perspective, I know you're not done yet, and I don't want you to be done yet, because there's more slides and more questions. But I did have a request from Mr. Bobker to speak before noon. And I also want to ask the other folks to, if you're intending to speak, if you could fill out a blue card if you haven't already. And then I want to take, even though you're not quite done, just a 10-minute break, and there's a reason for it. We'll take a later lunch break. It'll be a short one, but I want to take this one for those folks who haven't been able to tear themselves away from their seats so they can use facilities, get coffee, maybe get a snack downstairs, because I won't be taking lunch till 1 or 1:30 at the earliest, and then we'll come back and resume a little before noon. Is that all right? All right, but first we'll have Mr. Bobker for, if you can do 3 minutes, that'd be great, because I don't know how many cards I have, and I don't know how much time I'm going to give folks. And you all didn't ask for a panel, which I'm
Great.
surprised at. So,
Thank you.
huh? We said 3 earlier? Okay, 3 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Having been here to the bitter end many times, I
Well, that is
appreciate
why
being
I'm
able to
honoring
slide
your
once.
request, because you're one of those.
So I'll just sort of hit a few quick points and some thoughts for you as you go through the afternoon and early evening or whatever. The first is that, this is not a drought surprise. This is, a lot of people anticipated that this is what was going to happen. Many people have raised issues about the quality and reliability of the Bureau's temperature modeling. When you considered relaxing the water quality control plan objectives, a number of us raised the issue of, you really, really had to be tight in controlling storage in order to meet the temperature standards in the summer. The fact is that by relaxing the water quality standards, you enabled the transfer of water to consumptive uses. There was a release of, I don't know what the exact amount is, a couple 100,000 acre feet in April and May, which obviously had a direct impact on cold water storage. You should be asking about that. You should be talking about, whether that was the right thing to do and what were the reasons that happened. But that's, one of the major reasons that we're here. Secondly, when we talk about trade-offs, and what we can do with temperature control and temperature excursions, et cetera. 56 degrees for salmon, for salmonids, is not ideal. It's sort of a tolerable place. And when you go up from that, NIMS has identified that going from 56 to 58, you double the mortality. EPA has identified 55 as a much more desirable protective temperature standard. But what we do all the time is we move the temperature control point. We consider when things are bad, changing the temperature as well. When the temperatures go up and down, it's the up that counts. You're alive, you're dead, temperature goes down, you don't come back to life. That's the nature of temperature control. So you need to think about that in terms of how the temperature plan goes forward. The third point I want to make is that, it's so easy. Everybody comes in here and legitimately gripes about how they're suffering and, it's unfair. That a number of estuarine species are at the lowest or near lowest levels ever recorded. We are in a situation now where we're looking at the third year of impacts to salmonids, which means that, for a fish that lives 3 years, we're looking at potentially devastating the 3 years of the populations. So we're in a situation where, as bad as it is, irrigated agricultural beneficial uses will still be here in 5 or 10 years. Municipal and industrial uses will still be here in 5 or 10 years, and they will be flourishing. But your fish and wildlife beneficial uses, some of what constitutes your fish and wildlife beneficial uses may be gone. And that is not hyperbole. Everyone in this room knows that is true. So in going forward, you need to think about what is the board's plan to protect beneficial uses, because it's not just the water rights permit holder's responsibility. And it's not fair for Tom Howard to be pilloried, because he has to make tough decisions. You guys need to think about going forward, plan for a really bad water year 2016, and what are you going to do, and what are you going to require water users to do to prevent the total loss of a number of fish and wildlife beneficial uses. That's the unenviable situation you have. I'm sorry you're in it, but you're in it. Thank you.
Thank you. That is where we are. We'll come right back at noon. So get your snacks, get your caffeine, take your break, whatever you need, photosynthesize, whatever works for you.
you.